This is apropos. Well, officials here in Paris are expressing their dismay after a French scientist was denied entry to the United States because of text messages on their phone containing a personal opinion about the Trump administration. Separately, a woman who became a symbol of resistance during the US president's first term in office was taken into custody by federal immigration agents this week. With more on these and more high-profile deportation cases, here's our New York correspondent, Jessica Le Mesurier.
US President Donald Trump has turbocharged his mass deportation plan over the past few weeks. He has also moved to control the narrative by deporting a certain type of immigrant, perhaps to make an example of them. Let's take the case of Columbia graduate student Mahmoud Khalil. He's a green card holder, married to a US citizen, and he has been detained. He was detained on March 8th by ICE agents over what the Trump administration says is his pro-Hamas activity here in the United States. Now, he's currently in detention in Louisiana, but is due to be transferred to New Jersey. His lawyers argue that he is simply a human rights defender speaking out for the Palestinian people. And Khalil himself has said from detention that he is a political prisoner. It's unclear what will become of him. The legal wrangling over his case continues. Next, there's the case of a Lebanese doctor who is a transplant specialist who was working in Rhode Island. Now, she was on her way back to the United States from Lebanon after a family holiday when she was stopped by immigration agents, and she has now been deported back to Lebanon. They say that Homeland Security said that there were photos found on her phone of the late leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, and that they could not be sure that she didn't have bad intentions here in the United States. She was not afforded due process, and that is what is causing concern. There's also the case of an Indian student who was at Columbia University who participated in the protests, and she reportedly self-deported to Canada because she feared that ICE agents were after her. An example there of the chilling effect that these deportations are having. Then there is the case of a prominent immigrant rights activist, Jeanette Vizquera, who had famously avoided being arrested in the past. She had really been a thorn in Trump's side during the first administration. ICE had pursued her, but she had hidden in a church to avoid being deported. Well, she has now been detained. ICE agents reportedly caught up with her in the parking lot of the Target store where she worked in Denver, Colorado. So that's another very symbolic arrest of a human rights activist. Then there are these deportations of Venezuelans. The Trump administration said that it was deporting over 100 Venezuelan gang members. They were taken from the United States to El Salvador, and now they are in a maximum security prison there. And the controversy around that is the fact that they've been taken to a third state without their families being informed of that, and that their family members argue that they are not a part of any criminal gang. What's interesting to note is that actually the rate of deportations, according to the numbers, hasn't gone up under the Trump administration as compared to the Biden administration. But what has happened is the focus has changed, the narrative has changed, and there are a lot of concerns amongst human rights defenders that people are being deported without due process and due to their political beliefs.
Jessica Le Mesurier there reporting from New York. Well, for more, we're joined now by Veronica Cardenas, former Assistant Chief Counsel at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Thanks so much, Veronica, for being with us on the program. You actually spent 13 years with ICE. You now defend immigrants in the U.S. Is what we're seeing, all of that Jessica was reporting there, is any of this actually legal? The Trump administration appears to be defying court orders, not just on one occasion, but increasingly frequently over the past few weeks, even over the past few days.
Yes, thank you for having me. And so what I would like to really point out is how this administration, what's different about this administration is the way that they're trying to avoid immigration courts, they're trying to avoid federal courts, and they're trying to expeditiously deport people from the U.S. And I think that in this case is what's different from this administration to the administrations in the past.
And you say the system, it's become a machine of mass surveillance, indiscriminate arrests, fear-based enforcement that is actually doing very little to keep Americans safer.
Yes,
of November
and
5th.
the reason I wrote that is because I wrote that is because what we're seeing now is, sorry,
go ahead, Veronica. The reason you wrote it?
Sure. The reason I wrote that is because there really is an erosion of trust, of public trust here. So we see the president trying to take authority on his own, like enacting the Alien Enemies Act without having Congress first declaring war, so that he could expeditiously remove over 200 people who were in the United States who were waiting for their court hearings and remove them to El Salvador, where they will have to serve their prison time there for a year and work in those prisons. That's what we're hearing. And so what we're seeing is the erosion of public trust. And that is a dangerous thing, because not only are citizens being caught up in this, we've heard reports of that, but now people who are here with legal status don't know whether they can trust whether they're here legally or not, especially with how swiftly the Department of State is revoking visas during this time.
And you point out as well that some of the harshest policies that were introduced after the September 11th attacks, they were eventually rolled back because they proved to be ineffective. Is the same thing going to happen here again, do you think?
I think that this administration is not going to stop. I think that once there is a change in power, that future presidents need to really examine what dormant immigration laws need to be repealed, because this issue that we're having today has been a slow buildup. As we've seen with Jeanette Vizquera, who came in the 90s, there have been so many administrations who've tried to tackle on the immigration problem, and none have been successful. And laws that have been dormant, like the Alien Enemies Act, that has only been used 3 times, have been there for the taking. And that's what Trump is doing. He's taking advantage of laws that should have been repealed a long time ago.
And we've seen reports as well this week of people who are traveling into the US. For example, a French scientist who was denied entry because of text messages that they had in their phone. So how are immigration officers actually doing this? How are they discovering these kind of text messages? Is it a random targeting, or are they actually profiling people before they arrive in the United States?
I would say that it's both. So at the border, immigration authorities are at their highest. They don't really need to have any suspicion to do any type of search on people's phones, on their belongings. And they have the manifest of people who are landing before they board those planes. And so I'm sure they're taking a look at who's flying. And then once they come in, they have an idea of who they're going to take into secondary for further questioning.
And in your work with immigrants, because you work with them now, what kind of concerns are people raising with you?
I think the number one concern that most of my clients have is if they leave for the day to go to work, to go to the gym, to go grocery shopping, will they be able to come home to see their children? And what we're seeing right now is people are being, non-citizens who are being detained, are being transferred all over the US without their family members knowing, without their attorneys knowing, and they're going off grid for a few days until there's that communication again. And that's the part that scares non-citizens the most, that they are here, they're trying to do the best that they can under the circumstances to work, to provide for their families, to do things the right way, quote unquote, having their cases in immigration court and not knowing if they can see that to completion.
And it represents a massive departure from what would be the traditional kind of US immigration enforcement that would have always prioritized people who posed a risk to national security or public safety. So where is all of this going?
Right. And what we're seeing right now is a one-size-fits-all immigration, which does not work. Prior administrations have prioritized. There's a limited amount of resources, and where should those resources be directed? They should be directed to people who actually pose a threat. There should be investigations done into those people. And now it's everyone is a danger simply by being born in another place that's not the United States.
And you say as well, Veronica, that this kind of approach based on fear, it's emboldening vigilantes in various communities in the US, but it's also dismantling federal law enforcement. So what kind of an impact is all of this having there on the ground with the police?
Right. It is a devastating effect because people in authority like to be in those positions of authority. And what this administration is doing is bestowing the authority of immigration, which has always had a wide latitude and it's very dangerous, and putting that into state officials, those who want to take it. And so a simple traffic stop can turn into detention, where a person is now being sent on the next plane home without speaking to his family members or without speaking to a lawyer. And so those are the types of things that we're seeing right now.
And we've also seen, of course, the Trump administration doing what appears to be openly defying various court orders. We saw that in the case of Miss Vizcarra. Jessica you mentioned her as well. How concerned are you by what appears to be happening when it comes to various orders that are being issued by judges, and the Trump administration is proceeding with deporting these people regardless of the fact that judges are putting stays on those orders?
That is probably one of the most dangerous things that this administration can do. Say that he's going to impeach the judge because one judge put a stay on sending the airplane back to, or sending the airplane with Venezuelans to El Salvador. Those attacks really undermine our democracy because it emboldens others to say, well, the law doesn't matter and the president is above it and we stand with the president. And that type of rhetoric is exactly what this administration is going after. I do believe that the administration knew that they were wrong in sending that plane back. The judge, there's reports that show that the judge took a brief recession so that the Department of Justice attorneys could call ICE, could call the people they needed to tell the plane that there was an executive or that there was a stay, and that was ignored. And so what this administration is doing just to override the checks and balances that we have is very dangerous because it is encouraging others to disagree with the law and to take matters into their own hands, especially when it's non-citizens, because they're already a vulnerable population in the U.S.
Veronica, we'll have to leave it there for now. Thanks so much for being with us on the programme this evening. That's Veronica Cardenas, former Assistant Chief Counsel at the Department of Homeland Security. Well, that's it from us for now. Stay with